is Hannah Johnson, and I did my research on modern-day slavery. So my research question for this project was, to what degree is there a connection between slavery through the years, and how do Americans know or understand this connection and the effects around it? So a little bit of background on my information is that, as dark of a topic this is, I decided to research it based on previous research projects that I've done. It really interests me because it's a very unknown topic, yet 20.9 million people are affected worldwide because of it. It's a multi-billion-dollar criminal industry, and yet we still have very little education on modern-day slavery, which is why I want to make it more known and find more education on it, so we can help stop slavery. So I wanted to find the connection between slavery and history and how it connects to forced labor today. And that's kind of what I did for my lit review. I decided to go through time and starting at the beginning with ancient slavery and work my way up into modern day slavery. So starting with ancient slavery, humans have been being enslaved for thousands and thousands of years now. Dennis Bernhardt is a writer and editor and wrote about ancient slavery in his paper, Slavery, the Deep History of the Great Evil, and he talked about the society of the Göbekli Tepe. They were a group of people who are now in modern-day Turkey, and they created a caste system in order to have their society function easier, and within this they passed around women, which is very similar to slavery within their society, but this was actually to prevent incest. So it was really helping their society function in a much better and easier way. He believes that if there was not such this construction of a site, that it would not be as well functioned as it was. And then another article I found was by Kevin Bales, and he discusses in his journal, New Slavery, the transformation of an ancient curse, that the precise culture and social mechanisms that make slavery possible were how they were able to continue to function so well in their society. Bales also found in his journal that there's not a similar relationship between old slavery and new slavery. Old slavery had high purchase costs, long-term relationships between slave and slaveholder, and slaves were much more well maintained, whereas today there's very low purchase costs and slaves are disposable. Moving on is the transatlantic slave trade, which is the biggest movement of people in all of history. David Eltis is a Robert W. Woodruff Professor Emeritus of History at Emory University and has done extensive research into the history of slavery, and it specializes in the transatlantic slave trade. He wrote a paper briefly explaining why the transatlantic slave trade happened, and he concluded that Europeans had political, financial, and military power over the Africans, which allowed them to make this big mass movement of them into the Americas. They also had revolution and ocean-going technology, which just even more created a bigger power over the Africans. He said that it soon became a dangerous cycle because America started to grow, and that was meaning more labor was needed, so continuing to bring in more people. Karen E. Bravo, a professor of law and associate dean for graduate studies and international affairs, wrote a paper for the Seattle Journal of Social Justice, and she said that greed and profit became motivators in the transatlantic slave trade, which is very similar to human trafficking today, which is these owners participating in human trafficking have that greed and motivator for profit as well. So what was thought the end was the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, and President Abraham Lincoln wrote this in 1862, and it stated that all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state shall be then, thenceforth, and forever free. And so many Americans believe that when this was signed, this was the official end to slavery, but in fact it wasn't. It continued on for many years, but people still believe that this was the end. So moving through into the Holocaust, which consisted of Adolf Hitler convincing a mass amount of people that an entire population were the cause of the issues happening in Europe at the time. The issue moving into the Holocaust were that these slaves were not just sold and used for profit, they were simply disposable now. When Hitler was done with them, he wouldn't just pass them off to the next, he would kill them. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum wrote an article all about forced labor in the Holocaust and said that Nazis exploited the forced labor of the so-called enemies of the state, and they did this for the economic gain and to meet desperate labor shortages at the time. The slaves were used for Europe's economic gain, but they were without proper equipment, clothing, nourishment, and rest. Tova Van Winterstein is a U.S. associate professor at the University of Haifa and did a study on the psychological effects of the Holocaust. And she even looked into victims of the Holocaust who did survive, and she talked with one survivor named Simon, and he said you worked off of no food, water, and very minimal care. They had no fat on them, no muscle, and they were just skeletons working, and if you stopped, they would finish you. He recalls seeing people get shot in the back of the head, hit with shovels, and just killed out of, because they were not doing their job correctly, and this was very cruel and punishment that they were going through. Another article written by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum said that fear, greed, and deference to authority were the reasons of the Holocaust, which is very similar to the transatlantic slave trade and which is very similar to what modern day slavery is now. So other forms of forced labor in the 20th century happened when sweatshops started to really take a rise in the late 1800s and early 1900s. During this time, America was really interested in the high fashion end of Europe. Michael Zakum is an associate professor of history at Tel Aviv University, and he stated that in his paper that during this time, the consumer was removed from the actual making of clothing, which is the explanation for forced labor during this time. David J. Dury is a professor of labor and employment law in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, and wrote for the Journal of Business Ethics in 2011. And he looked into the companies Nike and Levi and how their business model does suggest that they use slavery and sweatshops to make their products. He said that Nike's business model has always been based on global outsourcing to low-cost jurisdictions. And he said that they will do anything to make the biggest profit possible, and that does mean outsourcing in foreign countries to make it cheaper to produce their products. So we know that slavery was very bad in the past, but how it has continued, and we still allow it to happen, is because of money and power. Our society revolves around money and the idea of the rise to power, and this has allowed us to continue to manipulate others into believing that using sweatshops and using this kind of forced labor is allowed because they can continue to make a good profit for their business. Carl Winterland, an associate professor of history at Barnard College, discusses this idea in his Journal of Economic Issues. He says they're forced to sell their labor power for money in order to gain access to a share of social wealth. And he says that money is seen as an expression of domination in our society, so that these companies have this sort of power over other people, allowing them to use forced labor. So moving into the 21st century, which is modern day slavery today, unfortunately it has now branched into so many different forms of labor. There is forced labor, bonded labor, child labor, and human trafficking, but they all fall under the broad umbrella of modern day slavery and exploiting slaves. Siddharth Kara is a leading expert on human trafficking and contemporary slavery. He's an adjacent lecturer on public policy at the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy and is a fellow at the Harvard School of Public Health, and he says that the human trafficking has taken over commercial sex, construction, domestic work, carpet weaving, agriculture, tea, coffee, shrimp, fish, minerals, stones, gems, and other numerous industries. So basically it's taking over every single industry that we know now and allowing slaves to work for these different industries. It also involves rape, torture, forced drug use, and the wholesale destruction of a human body, mind, and spirit. So it started as something in the past, as something very just the movement of people, and then continued into more of a forced way, and now it has turned into a mental and physical toll on these people. Daniel Sawyer is a professor of history at Fordham University and focuses on American immigration, but he also does extensive research into the history of slavery, and in his paper for the New Labor Forum, he says that sweatshops were very prominent in the 1900s. It started to die down, but now they're flourishing more than ever. And he says that the boss needs to get as much as he can out of them in order to survive on a narrow profit margin in a labor-extensive, low-capital, highly competitive industry, which is why they are turning to modern-day slaves. So moving into the method section of my paper, I decided to send out surveys to 100 different staff members at my school in Spokane, Washington. I sent out 100 and received back 50. The high school is a low to middle income area with most of the participants being predominantly white. I used systematic sampling, but they were volunteer basis, which is why I only got 50 back. Most of the participants when they came back were white with a few African American and mixed race, but most people ranged from 20 to 49 years old, and the distribution was even between males and females, which helped not to skew the data in any sort of way. For my procedure, I sent the survey out on April 9th and they had 1 week to do the survey and complete it back. The questions were split into 2 different sections. One were questions based on understanding. So I listed many different ideas of slavery, such as ancient slavery, transatlantic slave trade, and they came back and told me their understanding with little, some, or lots of knowledge on these topics. And then my next were consumer habits. So I listed a multitude of brands, some ethical and some unethical, and they were asked to list the number of purchases they've had from these brands in the last 12 months. And then the last question I did ask was if they knew that a certain brand was making clothes with slave labor, would they still continue to buy from this brand, and why or why not? So the purpose of the survey is I want to get education out more on modern day slavery, but I need to know what people understand and where the biggest issue lies with what they know and what they don't know. And I also want to know, do people know where their clothes are coming from and being made of? And if they do or don't, what are their feelings about slave labor in these different countries? So for my findings for the paper, for the 2 different sections, one on understanding, I asked questions on ancient slavery and transatlantic slave trade, and it came back with 35.47 people had lots of knowledge on these topics, and 10.42% had very little knowledge on these topics. And then another one was on human trafficking problem in Spokane, which is where I live, and 57.14 had no knowledge on this topic, which is very surprising to me because I looked into the survey of human trafficking in the Spokane region completed by the Inland Northwest Task Force, and they reported 51 cases in just 1 year alone, which is around a case a week. And for them reporting a case a week and not many people in Spokane know what the topic is, it's very scary. Then I asked questions regarding sweatshops, and 55.38% of people surveyed had only some knowledge on these issues. Moving into the brand section of my survey, the ethical brands I listed were North Face, Columbia, Patagonia, Adidas, New Balance, and LL Bean, and the unethical brands were Nike, Under Armour, Gap, Levi's, and Calvin Klein. Overall, 55.21% of participants had no purchases in the last 12 months from the ethical brands listed, whereas 35.96% of participants had no purchases in the last 12 months. And then for 1 to 5 purchases in the last 12 months, 35.57 brought from ethical brands, whereas 60.4% brought from unethical brands, and these numbers were about the same for both 6 to 10 purchases and over 11 purchases. So what all this meant to me was that Americans truly do not understand the extremity of modern day slavery and the connection between it from history on till now. Though the biggest contradictory element I found in my survey were that people said they would not purchase from an unethical brand, yet they had been listed in their survey. I had one participant said they would not promote a business if they don't value human life, yet they had purchased 5 times from 2 different companies that were unethical. And some also said, I'm not supporting something I don't believe should continue, and it's not right. They also had purchased from unethical brands. Though one big issue that I see with this research is money. There were many different participants that said they don't have a big budget and it's hard to always find reasonable prices of fair trade and labor brands, which is kind of the biggest issue I come with this research, is that these big companies have created such a big power for themselves that they're able to have such low prices, whereas the ethical brands, because they do make them here in the US with ethical ways, that they do have to charge more for their products, and that's very difficult in today's day and age where many people do not have that kind of budget to spend on clothing. So for my conclusion, I did conclude that to a large degree, there's a connection between slavery throughout the years, and Americans do not know and understand this connection. I do want to create more education, and that's kind of what I'm coming to, but anything can help, whether it's small, just by telling a friend or someone you know about modern day slavery, or much bigger as trying to create more education for your school. The more the word is spread, the less people have to give up their rights as a human beings to such an evil issue.
Hannah, what was the most important source of information you found while conducting your research, and why was it important?
I think the most important source I found was from Kevin Bales, and when I was starting my research, I believed going into it that there was a connection between new and old slavery, and he was able to kind of make that connection in his paper that there is, relationship. Old slavery was the high purchase costs and long-term relationship, whereas now there is very low purchase costs and slaves are disposable. So it kind of helped me to make that connection to continue then on with my research.
Hannah, what might be the real world implications or consequences, that means the effects, related to your findings?
Well, I want to create more education, but the issue with it is the money issue. I believe that more money should be put into task force in different cities in order to help stop these different forms of modern day slavery, but that is an issue with putting in more money because the different police in different cities, they also need to have funding in different areas, such as drug problems. So I think just finding that money and trying to, create some sort of budget to create more of a task force would be nice.
Thank you.
If you had 3 more months to work on this research project, what additional research strategies would you put into practice?
I'd probably try to split up my paper more into the different forms of modern day slavery, so the sex trafficking, forced labor, and kind of really try to focus more on one narrow road and really go deep into that road on why it's happening and the economic and political issues surrounding it, instead of kind of making it very broad and chunking it all together.
Nice job, you're done.